Welcome to week 2 of our advanced 10-week course. I'm excited to talk about pesticides and varroa management today. And so last week, we had some issues with the chat and Q&A, but it appears to be working for everybody. But if it's not, and you can't send a chat or an email, just email, Heather or I, and we can, well, email Heather, I'll be speaking, but just let us know if it's not working for you, and we can make sure to get to work. Next thing, so with the Google Classroom. Just let us know if you have access to it. I'll be sending an email after, each of these lectures, just providing information and everything. So I know some people had issues with their email getting onto the Google Classroom. So if you have any issues or are currently not on the Google Classroom, let us know. I know there's some issues with the recording, so we just made a private YouTube page. So that should make it easy for everybody to view the videos, and it also saves the storage on our end with the Google Classroom. So I want to give some updates about public service credits. And so one thing a beekeeper, I think Larry was talking to me about was he's giving a few talks and would like access to some of the presentations and pictures. So if you are giving a presentation and you want to use any of our A&M pictures or some of our slides, we are more than happy to share that with you. We'll be posting all of our presentations beforehand in the Google Classroom. So feel free to use those as you need as you start giving talks or presentations to local clubs. One thing we are currently developing is the slides. Let me hold on one second. Let me share my screen quick so I can show you what I'm working on to send to everybody. Do. So one thing we are working on are these pictures that go into medium frames. And so these pictures will send to everybody that's enrolled in an advanced course. And so we won't provide the boxes or the frames, but you can have these pictures and you put them into a medium frame, and you can use these for teaching purposes. And so we're working on this. We'll add the Texas Master Beekeeping logo next to the Path to Plate, but I think this would be really great educational tools for just young kids or other programs you might be doing during your public service credits. So it talks everything from bee development to swarming to foraging to worker bees and so on. And so this will fit into about 10 frames. And just let me know if you think this would be useful for you. But as part of this course, I'll send you guys a copy of this. It'll be all laminated and it should last a long time. One thing we are developing also is one with just diseases. And so I've started working on that with the Path to Plate program. So let me share that one. So yeah, I have one finished for chalk brood, but we'll do it for all the diseases. I think it'll be good just for either new beekeepers or just young people interested in beekeeping to know about the diseases and pathogens that impact honeybees. And so this one's just on chalk brood, but I think this will also go into medium frames and hopefully can be a good tool for you guys when you start collecting some of your public service credits. Some other public service credit opportunities. So I know the Houston Rodeo and Fairgrounds, they had their show. I'm not sure exactly which date. Maybe somebody put that in chat, but they have a booth each year, and it's a really great opportunity to volunteer and collect some of these public service hours. So if you're interested, just put your information in the chat. We can send you more information about who to contact and how to volunteer for some of these hours. But as we go, we'll be trying to post as many opportunities as possible. So, I know the Texas State Fair, they're always looking for volunteers at their honey booth. A lot of these regional fairs are looking for volunteers and opportunities. So, if you aren't able to find any opportunities to collect these public service hours, just please let me know and we can start sending you more and more information. So Sarah said that she's interested in the opportunity. So yeah, maybe Dodie or Heather can post in the chat about who to contact and how to volunteer during the Houston Rodeo. Some other opportunities that I'm working on that if you're interested, please let me know. So one is this Texas kind of almanac. So we have some really great information about beekeeping in the state of Texas, whether that's statewide, but also county by county, starting in about 1870. And I'll show you what it looks like. Share my screen quick. So we have this information from each county, And this is 1894, but we have it dating back to about 1860 or 1870. And they have the number of colonies, pounds of honey produced, and the value of beekeeping. And so if you're interested in helping me transcribe this, we have to do this for really every year going up to 2000, I think, before it became digitized. And so if you're interested and you want to collect public service hours, I can send you one of these sheets and you can help me transcribe this. It's pretty simple and straightforward. It just takes a little bit of time. So if you're looking for some public service hours, you want to collect a couple hours, I'll send you this information. And so it'll be good to see, how the number of colonies in the state, how much honey's produced, and wax has changed over the years, and maybe look at some of these specific counties. Another opportunity is I want to make sort of a foraging guide for beekeepers. So what type of bee plants are across the state. And so one thing that we have with Texas A&M was basically the person that had my role in like 1910, their goal was to work for bee forage across the state of Texas and looking at native and non-native plants. And so they wrote these really great descriptions about different plants across the state of Texas. And so I'd love to have some kind of field guide for bee plants and make a map about where these plants are found, the time of year that they're foraging, and when bees are collecting pollen and nectar, and then add some of these cool descriptions. So, for example, this sorrel says not plentiful for bee forage, but some say it's good for honey yield, like this hop tree, very good in favorable seasons. So this extension person back in the 1910 wrote some really great descriptions. And I think, if we can kind of transcribe this and then start building this forage map, we can make these more detailed and more applicable to beekeeping now. So this is all to say that we have a lot of opportunities to collect public service hours. So if you're interested in any volunteering efforts, please let me know. If you're interested in transcribing, honey yield over the past 150 years, please let me know. Or if you're interested in this kind of foraging guide for beekeepers, please let me know. Okay, perfect. And so if anybody in the chat has any other opportunities they want to share with the rest of the group, please let me know. I can also send an email to the broader listserv. So just let me know if you have any opportunities that you want me to share with beekeepers. But I think there's plenty of opportunities to volunteer and collect some of these public service hours. Okay, so I'm going to get my presentation set up. And Heather, if you have anything else to share, just feel free to speak and we can do that before we jump into the presentation. I wasn't sure if there's any common questions that people had that we should address now.
Um, well, I will say, Hives for Heroes is always in need of mentors. So if you're looking to mentor somebody, that's a really good avenue. It's something that I did myself. And then also too, we have a lot of people in our apprentice program. So if you're looking to mentor, and you don't want to do Hives for Heroes, that's another avenue we can probably we'll probably have some people that want to be mentored, that are in your area. So just reach out to us if that's something that you're looking to do. And that's all I really have right now, Garrett.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks for bringing Hive for Heroes. And we'll probably have a representative from Hive for Heroes just to talk to you guys about mentoring. They're always looking for mentors, so it's a really great opportunity to collect some of these public service credits. And as we shift over to hours, you'll be mentoring these beekeepers over an entire year, so it'll be easier to collect some of these hours with this mentoring. And so I mean, you can either mentor through High Street Heroes, or if you're actively involved with your county agent, or if you're mentoring a beekeeper in your local club, that all qualifies as public service hours. So if you have any questions about public service hours, we're happy to share more information and even provide you some opportunities. Um, One opportunity I'll probably share after this is Earth Day. So I know San Antonio is having an Earth Day event and they're looking for somebody from the Master Beekeeping Program. And so if you're in the San Antonio area and want to present at that, I can share you more information about that. But there'll probably be a lot more Earth Day events where they're looking for beekeepers to speak about bees and pollinators. And so I'll be sharing that when I get more and more information. So, but yeah, if you have any opportunities you want to share with the larger group, just put in the chat or send me or Heather an email, and we're happy to share it with everybody. Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's everything I had. And so I think we'll jump into the first section of week two. And today we're going to talk about bees and pesticides. And so pesticides are something that, all beekeepers across the country have to deal with. And so when farmers or, landowners or, residential people in the city have to manage a pest, they're typically applying some sort of, pesticide. And so while this can be a really great way to target and deal with some of these pest diseases, it can have a negative effect on honeybees. And so one thing I want to discuss today is really how much do pesticides play a role in bee deaths? And so we've been seeing, colony losses across the state this last summer, and a lot of beekeepers weren't sure if it's pesticide related or not pesticide related. And so we'll talk about, how pesticides contribute to some of the bee losses we've been seeing over the past, 5 to 10 years. And then I'll talk a little bit about signs of pesticide kill. And so how can you diagnose a pesticide kill and how does that differ from other, bee death related kills? And I also talk about the difference between a chronic death versus an acute death. And then I'll touch a little bit on types of pesticides. So there's a lot of pesticides applied throughout the state of Texas. And so this can range from insecticides, which target a pest. These can be fungicides that target, fungus, but can have off-target effects on bees. And then we'll talk a little bit about herbicides and how herbicides may potentially impact bees. And then we'll kind of finish on best practices for both beekeepers and applicators. And so this is something I share to a lot of pesticide applicators across the state. So, for applicators, they have to collect a certain number of CU credits each year. And so I've been invited to speak quite a bit about bees and pollinators. And so I'll talk to you a little bit more about how I'm educating them more about bees and pollinators and what they can do to help the bees across the state of Texas. So before again, when we think about colony losses, I like to call them really the five P's related to colony losses. And, beekeepers across the country have experienced somewhere between 45 to 50% of losses annually. Most of these losses are occurring with the commercial beekeepers because they manage such a large number of colonies. But even small scale beekeepers that have less than 50 or 10 colonies can experience some of these colony losses. And so when beekeepers come to me with a dead colony, I usually try to figure out if it's one of these five P's or a combination of these five P's. So number one are parasites, so the Varroa destructor, the small parasitic mites that feed on the bees and transmit deadly viruses and pathogens. I'll be speaking a lot more about this in the second half of the talk, but when you think about bee losses, a lot of what's happening is due to the Varroa mites. And then we have the pathogens. So pathogens include fungal pathogens, they include bacterial pathogens, and more importantly, they include viral pathogens. And so these viruses, there can be somewhere between 5 to 10 viruses associated with mites, and they be extremely deadly and virulent. And unfortunately, some of these are rapidly evolving, so we're always identifying new and more virulent strains. And so the most common of that is deformed wing virus, which I'll talk about in the second part of the talk. And so really when we think about bee losses, it's kind of a combination of the viral mites and the viruses that they transmit. The third P are the pesticides. And so these are pesticides that are applied for some sort of pests or fungus, but sometimes they can have an off-target effect on bees. And one thing I'll talk about is um, when we think about pesticide kills, we kind of focus on the acute kills. So that means when you have these massive colony losses and you have a bunch of dead bees at the bottom of your box. But a lot of times these pesticides are having these kind of long-term sublethal effects. So what that means is that you may not see the symptoms right away, but these pesticides are building up in the wax. They're causing, learning or memory issues. They're causing issues with foraging and all these different behavioral issues in the bees. And oftentimes it can cause slow death over time. And so a lot of times with these pesticides, you may not see damage right away. And what's been interesting is this past year, I've been collecting quite a bit of wax samples from beekeepers across the state, especially in Houston and San Antonio. And I've seen just a wide range of pesticides in the wax. And some of these pesticides have been, I guess, banned, 10, 15 years ago, but still being used. And so I think a lot of beekeepers want to blame it on mosquito abatement, but there's a lot of other pesticides used, especially in urban environments, that can cause issues with bees. And so if you're in an area near like a golf course or an HOA where they're heavily spraying to maintain a manicured lawn or a manicured golf course, it takes a lot to make sure that there's no insects or pests that are damaging that. And so they spray a lot of different chemicals to control that. And so it's just something to consider that not all you don't always see these massive die-offs. A lot of times with pesticides, you see these sublethal or long-term effects. Poor nutrition. So as land is converted from, conservation into agricultural crops, or even in urban environments where, buildings are being built and that land's taken away for bees, that can contribute to the problem also. And a lot of time with poor nutrition, it's kind of like us. If we aren't eating healthy and we don't have a healthy diet, that makes all these problems a lot worse. And so if bees don't have the proper nutrients, that's going to make the parasites worse, the pathogens worse, and make the pesticide damage a lot worse. And so nutrition typically is a major driver of colony losses, but it makes all these problems a lot worse. And then poor queens. So last week I talked a lot about poor queens and diagnosing, high quality queens versus queens that are failing, but this is another contributor of colony losses. Another thing I could probably add here is poor weather. And so weather can be extremely variable, especially here in Texas. And so if it's raining a lot, we have these really hot days, this can impact all these variables. So this is really all to say that these all kind of work in conjunction together, and certain issues can make other issues even worse. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of drivers of colony losses, and they all kind of work together to cause some of these issues. So from the USDA NAS survey, and I will say with this survey, there are some issues because they're typically only serving beekeepers that have um, are basically keeping bees as a business. And so they typically have over 100 to 500 colonies. And so I would take this with a grain of salt because we're not typically sampling or having the small scale beekeepers take the survey. But we ask beekeepers why their colonies are dying. Really, the two major reasons are the varroa and the viruses. So that typically contributes to about 80% of colony losses. But then we have pesticides, which contribute to maybe 6 to 10%. It really depends on the year when they're surveyed. So these surveys typically happen in quarters. And so during certain parts of the year, this pesticide related kills can be upwards to 20 to 30% of losses. But like I said, sometimes it's hard to tell whether your colony has a pesticide related kill or not because um, I think one thing we measure is those acute kills where there's a massive loss of bees at the bottom board with their tongue sticking out. But a lot of times these pesticides can be, um, I guess, sitting in the wax and cause these long-term sublethal effects. And so sometimes it's hard to diagnose whether it's a pest kill or not, or whether pesticides are contributing to some of these other damages. Okay, so next we'll kind of get into bees and pesticides. So the first thing to understand is, what causes bee losses. So I kind of outlined really the major drivers of bee losses, and you know, f- I think a lot of beekeepers, if they have piles of dead bees on the bottom board, with their tongue sticking out, they always assume it's pesticides, but sometimes it can be due to varroa mites. And so it's really important to understand, are bee losses related to the viral levels and the viruses that they're transmitting, or are they related to the pesticides that are applied or causing off-target effects? And so I'll talk a little bit more about, the signs of pesticide-related damage, but it's really important to know whether it's a varroa or pesticides. And obviously, you can do some testing. And, our veterinary diagnostic lab here at Texas A&M, we're adding honeybee diagnostics. And so we're adding viruses sometime this year. And hopefully, we can add some pesticide-related testing here in Texas. But in the meantime, pesticide-related testing is extremely expensive. And so I typically send it to the USDA facility in Gastonia, and they charge somewhere around $400 to $500 per sample to test for pesticides, whether that's in the dead bees or in the wax. And so, I mean, that's a pretty expensive invoice. And so if you can kind of diagnose these issues beforehand, but if you do want to test them, I can, send you to a lab, but just know that it will be pretty expensive. I'm hoping once A&M has our own diagnostic lab, it'll be a bit cheaper, but it's really important to know the signs so you don't have to, spend all that money on testing. So when you think about pesticide related kills, there's really two major types. So the
Hey,
first
Garrett,
type is,
somebody Can I interrupt?
Yes.
Somebody asked about PCR testing. Isn't offered through vetDNA.com was the question.
Uh, Yeah, so PCR testing is used for virus testing, and so when we're looking at what type of viruses are within the colony, we can use PCR to look at specific viruses, like the deformed wing virus or Israeli paralysis virus. PCR is not a way to measure pesticide-related residues in your wax or your bees, and so we have to use GCMS to actually test for that. And so while Texas A&M has that capacity, there's a lot of validation that goes into it to have it offered as a service. But we will use PCR testing for virus levels in your bees, probably starting this coming year. It just takes sort of a 12-step program to develop that and have it readily available. Did that answer the question? Okay, yeah, just let me know if that didn't answer the question. I'm happy to go more in detail about that. Okay, so when you think about pesticide-related kills, they typically fall into two major categories. So acute poisoning and chronic poisoning. So acute poisoning is when a pesticide, which is extremely toxic and has either on-target effects on the bees, so it's sprayed directly on the bees, or it's having off-target indirect effects on the bees, where it's spraying the foragers as they come back from the colony. And typically with acute poisoning, there's a clear symptoms of what that is. And so you can see the bees become more defensive. They become kind of disoriented in front of the colony or confused. They become kind of paralyzed, and you typically see a lot of dead bees at the bottom boards with their tongue sticking out. And so this was a case where this beekeeper had this pesticide-related kill. And as you can see from this picture, the bees are shaking their legs. They seem paralyzed and unable to move. And this beekeeper also had piles of dead bees at the bottom board. And so if you see a lot of dead bees and you see them kind of moving this jerky manner where they almost look paralyzed, this is a sign that this could be pesticide-related kill. And if you actually look closer, you can see their tongue sticking out. And so typically with a pesticide-related kill, their tongues are sticking out, they become paralyzed, and there's a ton of disorientation within the colony. Now, chronic poisoning is something not as clear and harder to diagnose because the effects aren't immediately apparent. And so one issue with wax is it's a lipid and it absorbs everything from the environment. So if bees are bringing in pesticides or pesticides are getting into the colony, they can be stored in the wax for years and even decades. And so if it's still in the wax, that can impact brood development, that can impact the queen as she's laying eggs, that can impact the workers, impacts everything. But something that you can't really see. You might see some your colonies getting smaller. You might see differences in egg laying, but it's hard to diagnose whether that's a colony level issue or whether it's due to some pesticide residues or chronic effects within the colony. And so a lot of times acute poisoning is easier to diagnose than this chronic poisoning. And a lot of times the pesticides are really having this long-term sublethal effect. So when you think about acute kills, there's really three major signs. And so one of them is sudden bee deaths. So what this means is if you inspect a colony one day and come back the next day and you see piles and piles of dead bees, that could be a sign of a pesticide-related kill. And as you can see from this picture, you can see that this colony was definitely really large a few days or weeks beforehand. But when this beekeeper came out, you can see all the piles of dead bees in the front of the entrance. You go into it, and all the bees are dead. There might be a few living, but they typically are paralyzed or, shaking their legs and unable to really move. And so you'll see a lot of these dead bees at the bottom board. And you'll see these bees that are shaking with their legs. Some might be standing, but they're unable to move forward. And if you actually push them, they'll be kind of stuck in one place, shaking their legs just like this. Because a lot of times, these pesticides are impacting their motor system and their muscles, and it causes them to really get overly excited and unable to move and become paralyzed. And then extended proboscis or their tongues. So you'll see a lot of dead bees that are paralyzed with their tongue sticking out. And so you may see your tongue sticking out, but that doesn't mean it's pesticide related kill. It could be a mite related kill or a disease related kill. But if you see these other two signs along with the tongue sticking out, that could be a very good sign that this was a acute kill from some sort of pesticide. And so in this case, if you want to learn more about what the pesticide was, we can have those samples submitted for testing. I do recommend contacting the Texas Apiary Inspection Service, and they can help you report some of these bee kills and provide you more information. Now, the chronic effects, like I mentioned earlier, are a lot more difficult to diagnose because they're having these sublethal effects, and it's hard to know whether that's pesticide related or something with the bees in general. But one thing that these chronic and sublethal effects have is one, reduced foraging. And so the bees become really disoriented and it makes it more difficult them to not only fly out and find these flower sources, but it impacts their memory. So the ability to come back, do the waggle dance, and communicate that flower source to other bees. And so what you typically see with these sublethal effects is changes in foraging, their ability to find the flowers, and you'll see sort of a decrease in the pollen and nectar brought into the colony. A lot of times this can impact the queen. And so the workers are really great at grooming and taking care of the queen, but there's some kind of pesticide related sublethal effects that can impact the queen's egg laying capacity, her ovary size, and her ability to lay a lot of fertilized eggs. And so a lot of times these can impact the sperm that she's storing, and you might see, queen failure because of that. But it's like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to tell whether this is a failing queen or it's failing because of the pesticides. And then just impaired navigation. So their ability to kind of fly back to the colony, they become a little bit disoriented, and this kind of goes hand in hand with foraging. So one thing that bees do to combat pesticides within their colony is what we like to call entombed pollen. And so when bees bring back pollen that's contaminated with pesticides, they obviously don't want to consume that, and bees know whether it's contaminated or not. So one way that they combat that is by filling it with propolis. And so a lot of times, if you have a lot of, I guess, pollen contaminated with pesticides, you'll see a lot of this entombed pollen within your colony. And if you take a forceps or a pliers and open this up, it'll always be this kind of dark brick red color. And so this is a sign that you may have a lot of pollen contaminated within your colony. And bees typically won't consume this, but this is a sign if you do have some bee bread within your colony, it could be contaminated with pollen. And so a lot of times with bees, they'll be bringing in a lot of fresh pollen, and they'll be consuming that first. But sometimes they'll store that pollen in their brood box, and if it's contaminated, when there's not good pollen flow coming in, they'll start consuming that contaminated pollen, and you start seeing some pesticide related damage. And so I've seen that a lot in the early spring when there's a lot of pollen in the comb that's contaminated with pollen. You start seeing issues with pesticide related kills because they're storing that pollen and then eventually consuming it. But one good way to see if there's pollen with pesticides residues in it is just look for this entombed pollen because I've seen frames that are just filled with this entombed pollen, and we know for sure that this is has pesticide residues in it. It's one way for bees to combat that. So how are bees exposed to pesticides? There's four major ways that bees can be exposed to pesticides. So number one is direct contact. So when an applicator is spraying and it gets directly on the colony, this really causes acute poisoning or acute kill. And so it's pretty rare for bees to be directly sprayed on top of, but it does happen, and this is where you see this kind of acute damage. Number two is indirect contact. So this is when the spray is not directly contacting the colony, but it's contacting the bees that are foraging, or it's contaminating the pollen and nectar that the bees are foraging, and either the bees are unable to come back to the colony, or they're bringing that pollen and nectar back to the colony, and that's causing issues with the rest of the colony. And so a lot of times, most of the damage is coming from this indirect contact. Now, drift is when typically with aerial applicators, so when a plane is flying over a field and spraying over an entire field, if it's really windy or the weather conditions aren't right, this can push this pesticide to the colonies and have off-target effects on the colonies. And so typically, I'd say this is probably more common in the Midwest, but it can occur in the Panhandle and parts of West Texas and even parts of East and Southern part of Texas. And so if you see a bunch of pesticide applicators, and one thing I tell them is, do not apply this when the conditions aren't right. If it's really windy and above 50 miles per hour, do not apply it because it will drift and will have off-target effects on bees and pollinators. And then contaminated water. So I do know just in general, applicators are really conscientious about contaminating the water. There's a lot of regulations with spraying near water sources, and so they're really cognizant of that. But one thing with pesticides, and as I get into some pesticides, some of them can be systemic, so meaning they can get into soil and they can move through the soil into water sources. And so bees are collecting water that's contaminated with pesticides. They can either die on site where they're collecting water, or they can bring that back to the colony and cause issues with the entire colony, whether those are the workers and the workforce or that's the queen. And so these are really the four major routes of exposure. So with direct exposure, this is typically when a pesticide is sprayed near or directly onto a colony. And like I said, this is not as this is very rare, or it doesn't happen as often as you think it would because, there's clear regulations about how things are applied, and applicators aren't supposed to apply them directly onto a colony. Now, does that happen? Yes. How rare is that? I'm not quite sure, but I think most of them are pretty aware about bees in the area. But sometimes if your bees are hidden and applicator is spraying, your colonies could be directly sprayed on and cause immediate harm or immediately kill within the colony. One thing it also causes a high dose of pesticide to be brought back into the colony. And so if it's sprayed, at or near a colony and you have a garden, for example, if that application is sprayed directly on that flowering source, the bees will directly bring that back to the colony and cause direct issues to the colony, whether it's the workers or the queen. And really, so the direct exposure is the type of exposure that causes the hugest damage and the most acute damage to a colony. Indirect exposure happens when bees are foraging. And so, like I mentioned last week, bees can fly somewhere between a mile to even 3 to 5 miles away, depending on how far away some of these flower sources are. And so bees are flying 3 to 5 miles away, and you're in a sort of a high intensive agriculture area that risks bees to be exposed to some of these insecticides or pesticides. And so when bees are foraging and applications occurring, those bees can be directly contacted and killed directly in the field, so they're unable to come back. But a lot of these pesticides can actually go through the flower and go into the pollen and nectar and be back to the colony and impact brood development, impact queen quality, and cause colonies to decline. And so I would say most likely most of these pesticide related kills are happening with these indirect exposure, and they can cause acute kills, but a lot of times these are causing these chronic long-term effects because this pollen's contaminating the wax, exposing more of the bees, and you're not going to see that massive die-offs from this indirect exposure. Like it does happen, but most of the time it's causing sublethal effects. So drift is something when these applicators are flying over an area and spraying over an entire field. Typically, it's happening adjacent to blooming weeds or what bees are actually foraging on. So, if an applicator is spraying in an area and it's really windy, that can drift either onto what the bees are foraging on or it can drift directly onto a colony. And so I know a researcher at Purdue in Indiana did a lot of studies on drift and found that, especially neonicotinoids, when it's really windy in the Midwest, they can directly drift onto a colony and cause some of these bee-related deaths. But I would assume this happens in certain parts of Texas, especially the Panhandle and places where aerial applications are really high. And even in the southern part, when they're doing mosquito abatement or when they're doing some other pesticide-related kills, this drift can be a really big issue and cause issues with either the bees foraging or directly onto the colony. Now, one thing I tell applicators is there's things to reduce drift. And so you can reduce it by using different core sprays. You can use different nozzle sizes, and definitely you're not supposed to apply it during really windy conditions. And so this is something I really push to applicators. Now, do they follow those? I don't know, but at least they give them some guidelines how to reduce that. So making sure that they are aware of it and they can do things to reduce any pesticide-related kills from drift. So contaminated water is where these pesticides get into a water system, and obviously they typically have a bigger effect on some livestock or other, I guess, wild animals that are, going to the water sources, but they can have an effect on bees. And so bees need water to ventilate the colony, especially in these hot Texas weather. And so bees are going out, collecting this water and ventilating the colony to keep it at that 95 degrees. But if that pesticide's happening into the water source and they're bringing that back, the bees could either die as they're collecting that water or bring back to the colony and contaminate the entire colony. And so, there's clear laws and regulations like the Clean Water Act to make sure that this water sources don't get contaminated, but it happens a lot, and there's more residues in the water than you think there would be. So, what are the types of pesticides applied? So there's really three major types of pesticides. And so pesticides are just what is applied to either manage a pest, manage a fungus, or manage weeds. And so the first type is insecticides. So insecticides are by far the most toxic to bees. And the reason for it is because they're developed and they're applied to really kill a pest or an insect. And so because bees and honeybees and other native pollinators are insects, these insecticides are not only going to affect the pest, but also impact the honeybees, whether that's direct contact, drift, or indirect contact. And so insecticides are by far the most toxic to honeybees and even some native pollinators that we'll talk about next week. Fungicides, so these are typically applied to treat fungus type diseases. And so fungicides are sort of a mixed bag. Some fungicides are extremely toxic to bees. Some fungicides aren't, so it kind of depends on what they're applying. But one thing we do know is if fungicides are applied with insecticides, that can make insecticides even more toxic and make the fungicides even more toxic. Now, fungicides typically disrupt the foraging behavior, but can also have an impact on bee development. So, even though queens may be laying 1,000, 2,000 eggs per day, this can cause some of those bees to be unable to develop into adults, and that'll impact your colony growth and size. And so fungicides are sort of a mixed bag, and it really depends on the type. Herbicides. So herbicides typically, I'm just going to stress typically, do not have direct toxicity to honeybees. They typically have indirect effects. And what that means is bees heavily depend on some of these weeds, especially in the spring or throughout the year, to collect pollen and nectar. And so, if farmers are applying herbicides and killing those weeds, that takes a really important resource away from the bees. And so, typically with herbicides, they're typically impacting the resources available to bees. That causes poor nutrition and impacts some of these other issues. But herbicides can be toxic, and we're learning more about some of these herbicides. And so we're learning more about some of them actually be more toxic to bees than we ever imagined. And so even though we typically don't see them as being toxic, some of them could be toxic and cause issues with bees. And so um, I don't have a list on me right now, but yeah, some of them can be extremely toxic to bees, but mainly they're taking away the nectar and pollen resources from the honeybee colonies. But also with, all of these, they can be mixed different ways. There's typically, adjuvants. So those adjuvants basically help that, pesticide mix so they can apply it and be more targeted. And some of those adjuvants can actually make these pesticides even more and more toxic. And so a lot of times with all these, you know, the active ingredient can be really toxic, but what makes them even more toxic is how they're mixed, the formulation, and other things like that. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more, but um, it really depends on how they're mixed and how they're applied. So one way that the EPA and I guess we as researchers measure toxicity is by this number called LD50. And so LD50 basically means LD stands for lethal dose, and 50 means the lethal dose when 50% of the individuals die. And so what researchers do and what the EPA does is they have these cage studies and they apply different dosages of this pesticide. And what they measure is the bee mortality. And so when 50% of the bees die, that's what we like to call the LD50 number. And so this is what we're typically making our regulations on is based on this LD50 number. Now, you can say a lot about how they're if this is the most accurate, right? Because they're testing it just on either individual bees or cage studies that have 50 to 100 bees. They're starting to add more and more testing to look at colony level effects and even sublethal effects because really LD50 is looking at this acute kill. But as I mentioned beforehand, there's a lot of sublethal effects we may not be measuring. One thing they are starting to look at a bit more is how this gets into the wax and causes some of these long-term sublethal effects. And so I guess we still need to learn more about how to make these measurements and provide more of these recommendations because LD50 is a good first metric, but there's a lot of other metrics we definitely need to consider. So insecticide toxicity can target insects in really three major ways. And so as I talk about each class of insecticide, they're targeting pests in either the nervous system, the muscle system, or development. So the nervous system, this is really the system that really connects the brain to the rest of the body. And so as the bees are foraging, they're learning, and they have some kind of environmental cue, they use these electrical signals to cue the rest of the body to either move, to defend the colony, or to fly to a new flowering source. So the central nervous system, or the nervous system, is extremely important for transferring information throughout the entire bee body. What insecticides typically do is they target this nerve system so that really either overstimulates a response or inhibits that response. So I guess the memory and the learning and I guess the functionality of the bee is unable to work. And so what it does is it always overstimulates the body and causes this paralysis, causes the bees unable to forage, and causes other issue within the colony. And so, with humans, right, we have a centralized nervous system, we have a brain that's controlling the rest of our nervous system, whereas honeybees, they have little brains throughout their entire body. And so that's one reason that you can see different effects in the abdomen versus the thorax. The muscle system, so, honeybees have muscles throughout their entire body, but the biggest and most important muscle is their flight muscle and their thorax. And this flight muscle is in charge of helping these bees fly, a mile to 3 miles away to the flower sources. It's really important for the bees to move because that's where the three legs are attached. And so these muscles help them move and, transfers throughout the colony. And so a lot of these insecticides can target the muscle system, so that impacts the muscles and makes the insects unable to fly or unable to move within the colony. And then the final is development. And so some of these insecticides actually target development. So a lot of insects are holometabolists, but some are have different developmental stages. But what they do is they target development. So these immature larvae are unable to reach adulthood. So it basically keeps them in this immature stage, and then eventually they die. As we think about how insecticides target, I guess, insects, but also bees, is through either the nervous system, the muscle system, or through development. So with the central nervous system, what happens is there's electrical signals that are sent throughout the entire bee body, and these provide a really quick signal to tell the bee what to do, whether that's to move, whether that's to fly, whether that's to take care of other workers, whether that's to produce a pheromone. These electrical signals are extremely quick and provide an immediate response. And so that's one way that bees can respond to anything. So what happens is this is what a nerve looks like. This electrical signal is sent through this nerve ending, and then once it reaches the end, it sends a neurotransmitter across to the other nerve ending. And these neurotransmitters are typically serotonin and dopamine. So that means when you're having a really fun time and you're, maybe have some alcohol in your system and you hear about that dopamine rush, what happens is this electrical signal is releasing more of this dopamine, and that's causing an immediately, you immediately become energized, become really excited, you become really happy, and that's because you have a really strong electrical response in your nervous system. Now, for honeybees, what's happening with these pesticides is it's causing basically that same dopamine rush with bees. It causes overstimulation, it causes these neurotransmitters to quickly go across and causes bees to become paralyzed because they're just really overstimulated. Sometimes it can inhibit the system where this electrical signal makes it across here, but that neurotransmitter is unable to go across, and that stops the signal right on site. And so these pesticides, most of them are definitely targeting this nervous system for bees. The second one, like I mentioned, is muscle systems. And so I talked a lot about foraging. But we look at these bees, right? They're moving calmly across the comb. They're doing all the tasks within the colony, whether that's nursing behavior, whether that's foraging, whether that's guarding. And what's really running this is the muscle system within the thorax. And a lot of these insecticides target the muscles and cause these bees unable to move or forage. And that's where you see that quick twitching motion. And so some of these insecticides are toxic because it impacts the muscles directly. And then finally, development. And so I didn't talk about this too much last week, but one reason that we have queens and workers is through this hormone called juvenile hormone. And so with queens, because they're raised in larger cells and they're fed more food, they have higher hormonal levels called juvenile hormone or JH. So because they have higher hormones, these queens get bigger, they develop ovaries, and they have capacity to lay eggs. Whereas workers have lower hormone levels and they're able to develop into specialized workers. But what happens is when they go from this larval stage into pupation to become an adult, this hormone drops and that allows them to molt and become a pupa. But what happens with a lot of insecticides, it keeps this JH at a really high level, so they're unable to mute and enter pupation. So these bees are basically have these high hormone levels, they're unable to get pupation, and they're stuck at this larval stage for multiple days after that. And once they, reach 3 to 5 days after that stage, then they basically die and unable to molt and become an adult. And so what a lot of these are doing is keeping this hormone level alive, so it's keeping the bees at that immature stage. Okay, so when you think about insecticides, and so when I say insecticides, these are insecticides that are targeting insects. And so a lot of times they're sprayed and applied to target a pest or type of insect. But like I mentioned earlier, if these are targeted towards an insect, honeybees are also an insect. And so any type of insecticide will have some sort of effect on bees. Whether that's toxic or not, it depends on the type, but a lot of them will have some sort of effect on bees, whether that's a chronic effect or an acute effect. And these are the different, I guess, classes of insecticides, so the different types of insecticides. And I think we've all kind of heard about these different classes of insecticides. There's common trade names within these classes, but these are probably the most commonly used insecticides across the state of Texas and really across the United States. So number one are neonicotinoids. We call them neonics. That's probably the most common and the one that most beekeepers know about. And so they're systemic, so meaning that they can transverse the entire plant, get into not only the soil sources, but also the pollen and the nectar. Butanolides are very, very similar to neonics. They're kind of a new class of systemic insecticides, and they act exactly the same as neonics. They're marketed to being less toxic to honeybees, but we're learning more that they have some toxicity to honeybees, but maybe not as toxic as neonics. Pyrethroids. So a lot of beekeepers, you kind of hear about pyrethroids. So with mosquito abatement and a lot of other application, pyrethroids are really, really common. And so pyrethroids are found throughout the state of Texas, especially the southern part. Then we have organophosphates and carbamates. They also both impact the central nervous system, but these are extremely toxic to bees. Phenylpyrazoles, diamides, and then insect growth regulators. And so these are really the three major types. I'll go into more detail, but just know that there's different, I guess, types of insecticides within each class. So the first class are the ones that are attacking the central nervous system or the nervous system for honeybees. So that means it's impacting this nerve ending and either one causing overstimulation in the nervous system or really inhibiting this nervous system so the bees are unable to respond and it stops the signal right here. So the signal's not going throughout the body, not reaching the brain and reaching other parts of the bees. So the first insecticide class that impacts the nervous system are neonicotinoids. So the first thing to know about neonics are they're systemic. So meaning if they're applied either through a seed treatment, so the seed is coated with insecticides, or it's some kind of spraying directly on the soil or onto the plant, then that means that insecticide can get throughout the entire plant. So a lot of times, if it's applied onto a flower, it'll go into the soil system, it'll travel through the plants and get into the pollen and nectar. And so systemics can be a really big issue because they can cause long-term effects that we may not be able to see right away. So we talk a lot about the chronic effects that we can measure or the acute effects that we can measure, but the chronic ones are what's the biggest concern with systemics because they can be in the flower for longer periods of time. What they target is the nicotine acetylcholine receptors, and I'll show you a picture of that. But what it does is it causes overstimulation of that nervous system. So when we think about like a dopamine rush that we may have in like a party setting or when we're having a sort of a really fun, enjoyable time, what's happening is it's causing that same overstimulation and causing that nervous system to kind of go in overdrive. And what I'll say is the nicotine receptor for insects is a little different from humans. So what that means is humans have different nicotine receptors than what insects have. And so this nicotine receptor is directly targeting the nicotine receptors for insects. And so that's one reason that nicotinoids are not toxic to humans, because the nicotine that we consume through smoking or other forms are targeting a different receptor, whereas this is a different type of nicotine. But what it typically does is it impairs foraging, learning, and memories in bees. Now, nicotinoids have been banned from the European Union. I think it's been quite a few years now, 15 or 20 years. It's recently been banned in New York State, and so that's the only state that I know of in the United States that has banned nicotinoids. And that's actually a pretty new development. I think it happened probably less than a year ago. So what do nicotinoids target? So nicotinoids are extremely, I guess, widespread. It's used for a lot of different things. And the reason it's so widespread is it's a really effective pest management tool for a lot of these pests. And so we think about, these pests that target, field crops such as cotton, wheat, even these greenhouse or horticulture crops, even vegetable or fruit crops. They're really effective at targeting all these different pests. And so that's one reason it's widely used and widely used to target all these pests. And here's just kind of a list of some pests that nicotinoids target. So one of them is aphids. So aphids are these type of insects. They're extremely small and you might see them in the garden, but they're major pests of cotton, wheat, and vegetables. White flies are extremely small flies that can damage some sort of crop. They typically target tomatoes, melons, but they can also target corn or soybeans. And so white flies is a big issue in either a field setting, but even inside a greenhouse, white flies can be an issue. Leaf hoppers, this is what a leaf hopper looks like. They can spread diseases. So one of the major issues is not only eating on the plant, like you see in this picture, but they spread a lot of diseases to, grapes, sorghum, and other crops. Thrips are a really big thing for, horticulture and greenhouse crops, but they can damage cotton, peanuts, and vegetables. So thrips are a really big issue in some fields. And actually, one thing that's really interesting about thrips, I actually found some thrips in a honeybee colony. I'm not sure if they do anything. Maybe they're just feeding on the honey within a colony, but there are some thrips in colonies in Texas. We talk about scale bugs, and so when we think about crepe myrtles, especially, they have some of these scale insects that can cause really big issues. And so typically they're affecting the fruit plants and the nut plants, such as citrus, pecans, and then widely found in landscape plants, such as crepe myrtles. Mealy bugs, we have chinch bugs. And so this is a really major one for turf grass. And so these turf pests are a really big issue in golf courses. And so one way they can maintain a really pristine and well manicured golf course is by managing some of these turf pests, such as cinch bugs. And so nicotinoids, and even pyrethroids are very common in golf courses and turf grass type areas. And then, some nicotinoids are used for fleas, so for pet flea treatments. It's not as common, but sometimes it's used. Termites, sometimes it's used, where they're kind of pre-spraying a house or spraying inside like a HOA, for example, for termites. It can sometimes be used. And then it's commonly used for corn rootworms. And so it's a key pest for corn production. And so, I mean, I guess I mentioned a lot of different pests related to different crops, but this all to say that nicotinoids are widespread and can be used to target a lot of these pests. And that's one reason that we hear a lot about in the news because it's been widely used, really starting in the 1995 to early 2000s. So nicotinoids target the nervous system. So when you think about those nervous system receptors, what typically happens is there's this channel. And in order for basically those dopamine, that serotonin to move over from one axon to the next is through this ion channel. So what this channel does is it basically releases the sodium ions through this channel, and that causes either this channel to be active or inactive. And so if you want that response across that axon, this channel has to be either open or cut. In order for that channel to be open and cut is there's this acetylcholine, which is right here. And what happens is this esterase, or this enzyme, takes that acetylcholine off and breaks it apart. Once this breaks it apart, that causes this channel to close. And so the acetylcholine is really important for the channel to open and close. So what happens with neonicotinoids, though, what it does is it basically takes the place of acetylcholine. So when that enzyme comes to break apart that acetylcholine to shut this channel, it can't do it. This acetylcholine can't take that nicotinoid off, take it, and break it apart, and so that channel remains open. So what that means is all the sodium is flowing through the system. That's causing an overstimulation and causing those nerve endings to really go into overdrive. And that causes the bees to become paralyzed, start shaking their legs, and so on. And it's really impossible to reverse this effect. And so most of the insecticides I'll talk about have this very similar channel and target this very specific pathway. But what they typically do is targeting this so it causes overstimulation or it causes it to close so it's not working at all. So we think about the type of neonicotinoids used. There's about five that are common throughout the state of Texas, and some are used for different crops for different reasons. The top three are probably the most common. Imidacloprid is one of the most commonly used in row crops. So it's commonly used in cotton, corn, and sorghum. It can also be used for a lot of citrus crops. Thiamethoxam is typically used as a seed treatment. And so typically with corn, they have these seeds that are already coated in nicotinoids. So what that means is these seeds are already pre-treated at the time of planting. So what happens is when they're planted, that can cause dustings, right? Because they're planting them into the soil so that residue can get into the dust and then spread throughout different colonies. But then as that plant grows, that nicotinoid's already in the soil, it's already in the plant, so it can move throughout the entire plant into the nectar and the pollen. And so thiamethoxam is a really common seed treatment and a really big issue for bees. And seed chip treatments are typically applied for, corn, cotton, and wheat. Um, but sometimes they can be used as a foliar spray, so meaning it's something like this where they're actually spraying the leaves for neonicotinoids, but it's more commonly used as a seed treatment. Clothianidin is another type of neonicotinoid. It's found in, a lot of these crops like corn, rice, and also common in seed treatments. Cetamiprid is used in, fruit crops such as citrus, apples, vegetables. It can also be used for watermelon, and a lot of times it's used for ornamental for aphid and white fly control. And so you think about these places that, grow some of these ornamental crops, they're typically using this type of neonicotinoid. Dinotefuran is applied in urban pest management. So you see this a lot in urban environments where they're trying to treat for termites, cockroaches, they're treating for, ants. Um, this is what's commonly used for that. It's also commonly used in turf grass and golf course settings. And so a lot of times when I sample beekeepers that have colonies in, I guess, really that urban environment, I see neonicotinoids, it's typically this dinotefuran. Whereas, in the rural environments with the row crops, I typically see midocloprid, thiamethoxam, and clothianidin. And I will say, I practice these words a lot, so I'm still working through some of these. I know these pretty commonly, but some of these, they are kind of hard words to say. So maybe you have to practice them in the mirror a few times like I did. Okay, so butanolides are sort of a new type of systemic insecticide. And so they behave exactly the same as neonicotinoids, but they're marketed as being less toxic to honeybees, but we are seeing that they can be toxic to some extent, in effect. And so like I mentioned, they're systemic, so that means they're absorbed into the plants, absorbed into the soil, and can get into the pollen and nectar resource that the bees are collecting. Similar to neonicotinoids, they're targeting the nicotine receptors for insects. And so they basically act exactly the same as neonicotinoids. And similar to neonics is they're impacting the bee learning, the foraging, and more importantly, the immune function. So that means if bees are exposed either directly or indirectly, this could lead to bees having, I guess, more of these disease-related diseases or pathogens within their colonies. And typically its target is really the same insects, so the aphids, the white flies, the leaf hoppers, and a lot of these row crops. Okay, so the first part I was really focused on, really the nicotinoids and the systemic insecticides. Next, I'll talk about, pyrethroids. So pyrethroids were first found because they're a common a component in chrysanthemums, flowers, and so they're really a natural compound, But what happened was there was this synthetic form that really replicated and mimicked that natural form to make some of these synthetic pyrethroids. And so sometimes you can use, the natural pyrethroids, but a lot of times what you find in the store are these synthetic pyrethroids. And so what they do is they actually act very similar to nicotinoids in that they disrupt the sodium channels and cause overstimulation and other nerve issues. And so their pyrethroids are actually targeting the exact same pathway as nicotinoids and butylides. But one thing that's different by pyrethroids is they're not systemic. So that means that they're not getting into soil, they're not transpersing throughout the plant, and so they're not staying in a plant or the pollen sources for a longer period of time. And so that makes them, even though they can cause direct paralysis and death, most of the effects are kind of these sublethal effects, but they're not causing the same long-term effect as nicotinoids and not even causing other issues in our water or in soil systems. But similar to nicotinoids, these are probably the second most commonly used in agriculture because they're really effective at targeting pests. So this is a very similar channel, right, as nicotinoids. And so what happens is this channel allows these sodium ions to flow in and out. When it's open and the sodium ions flow through the channel, that allows overstimulation and allows sort of that rush for the bees to move and fly. When it's closed, it causes really the bee to not move as fast and not have that reaction. So what this pyrethroid does, it kind of acts in two ways. Either it directly closes that channel so these ions are unable to go through, and so really it blocks that signal, or it's keeping this channel open so those ions are flowing through and causing overstimulation with the bees. And so these pyrethroids are really acting on the exact same channel as neonicotinoids, but they can act as either closing that channel permanently or keeping the channel permanently. But really, what all this means is either causing an overstimulation or causing bees to unable to react to anything. Because this really impacts the entire nervous system of bees. Okay, so pyrethroids in Texas. So there's some commonly used ones, and I guess I did list all the pests for nicotinoids, and really pyrethroids are targeting all the same pests as nicotinoids. And so sometimes farmers will use a mixture of nicotinoids and then pyrethroids in their pest management plan. But these are probably the most common pyrethroids. Some are used in real crops or agricultural settings, but a lot of these can be used in urban settings, and a lot of urban pest management folks use these type of pyrethroids in their system. So bifenthrin is typically used in real crops. So this is a very common agricultural chemical. And I've done quite a few wax pesticide samplings across the country. And this is one that I found in a lot of the wax samples. So this is very common, very widespread, and starting to be probably the most used pyrethroid, not only in Texas, but across the entire US. So it's typically used in real crops such as corn, cotton, and soybeans. And so when you think about nicotinoids, bifenthrin and nicotinoids can be used together to treat some of these issues. And so some farmers might be using a combination of both to manage some of the pests for some of these real crops. I do see it a lot also in urban pest management. So one thing with bifenthrin, it's really effective for ant treatment. So it's typically used for fire ant treatments, but can be used for a lot of urban pest management, such as cockroaches and termites. So bifenthrin is a pretty common not only in real crops but also urban pest management. And so if you do have kind of ants in your area and you're thinking about applying some sort of insecticide to kill the ant nest, try not to use bifenthrin because it's one of the most toxic pyrethroids. Permethrin is one thing that I'm not sure it's common, I guess, but I think a lot of people are aware of permethrin rather than bifenthrin. So permethrin is the typical pyrethroid used for mosquito control. And so, in August, when there's these heavy rainfalls, or maybe there's a hurricane or a tropical storm, cities, especially in the southern part of Texas, will apply permethrin through dustings or, I guess, fogging in these major cities. And so when you hear about the fogging, they're typically using permethrin. Now, that's not always the case. So I don't want to say that permethrin's always used, but typically what they're applying is some sort of pyrethroid, and it's commonly this permethrin. It can also be used for livestock protection. So a lot of farmers and ranchers use it for livestock protection from different pests that they deal with, and then sometimes it's used for home sprays. So I think in some of these Home Depot or Lowe's, they sell some of this permethrin in sort of a squirt bottle you can buy. Cypermethrin is found in applications for cotton, vegetables, and fruit crops. And so this typically isn't found in urban settings, but typically found in some of these major row crops. And so, you can kind of find it, in these kind of really rural areas. So if you're kind of located in West Texas and you kind of look around a cotton field, you might see this cypermethrin in some of your samples and may cause some issues. Uh, so lambda cyalithrin, cyalithrin. So lambda cyalithrin is used in corn, sorghum, and wheat. But one thing I will say about this, I actually get a lot of questions about this in urban settings, and so a lot of urban pest applicators ask me about this. And so even though I list that's using corn, sorghum, and wheat for army worm control and aphid control, it's actually used a lot in urban pest management also. And so this is something I see a lot of colonies managed in urban areas is this lambda cyalithrin. Deltamethrin, commonly used in structural pest management. So what that means is this is another one that's commonly used in urban environments. So it's used for, termites and cockroach controls, but more importantly, it's used for lawn controls and, controlling like turf grass. And so a lot of times when people are trying to, maintain a manicured lawn or HOAs are maintaining a certain area to have this really green grass, they're using this type of pyrethroid to manage and control some of these pests. Um, Isventhrate is Valorate is applied in fruit orchards, vineyards, and vegetable crops. And so really, I guess if you want to know if it's a pyrethroid or not, it always ends in this ren. So bifenthrin, permethrin, cypermethrin, and so on. That's how you know if it's a pyrethroid or not. Okay, so organophosphates. So organophosphates actually act the same as a pyrethroid and a nicotinoid. So what it means is they impact this really kind of nicotine receptor and leads to, excess nerve stimulation. So the bees are overstimulated, and that eventually leads to insect death. Now, I did talk a lot about how pyrethroids and nicotinoids can be toxic to bees, but this is probably one of the most toxic pesticides that can be applied, and that impacts not only honeybees but other pollinators. And so it acts very similar to nicotinoids, but in organophosphates instead don't target the receptors like nicotinoids, they target the actual acetylcholine. So I have a picture of this. So this is really the system of nicotinoids. So like I mentioned, there's a channel, and in order for like a nerve stimulation, the sodium need to flow through the channel to cause that stimulation for a bee to move or fly. If they want that stimulation to end, this acetylcholine is broken down, and that causes this gate to basically shut. And so nicotinoids, what they do is they take a place of the choline. So this enzyme is unable to take off that nicotinoid, and that causes overstimulation and that channel to remain open. So for organophosphates, instead, it attacks the acetylcholine. So what it does is it basically takes the place of this, and it's basically the exact same thing, or it takes place of this, the acetylcholine enzyme. And so what this organophosphate does, it takes place of this, so it's unable to take that acetylcholine off, break it apart, and either open or shut that channel. And so nicotinoids are basically taking the part of acetylcholine, whereas organophosphates are taking that enzyme that breaks apart that acetylcholine. But basically, they're targeting the same method, and it's causing the exact same nerve endings. But the problem with organophosphates is this can be extremely more damaging and can cause extremely permanent damage. So that's why it's more toxic than nicotinoids and even pyrethroids. So these are the different types of organophosphates. Chlorpyrifos is probably the most common. This one I hear a lot of questions from applicators. So it's used a lot in the urban and even rural environments. So, think about all these crops that we consume. So corn, soybeans, citrus crops, cotton, uh, chlorpyrifos is commonly used for all of these. It's been phased out, and I think it's really fortunate for beekeepers because this was, extremely toxic to bees. So I'm really glad it's starting to get phased out and now it's commonly used for farmers. Malathion, this is another one that's commonly used for mosquito control, but I will say that pyrethroids, such as permethrin, is probably the most common use for mosquito control. But malathion might be used in an urban environment to control mosquitoes. And so I really hope the city is using pyrethroids rather than organic phosphates because, like I mentioned, these are definitely more toxic to honeybees, and they have a longer toxicity to honeybees rather than pyrethroids. Um, but your city may be using this type of control for mosquitoes. But it's also commonly used in fruit and vegetables and ornamentals, sometimes used in livestock protection from some of their pests and fleas. Diazinon, I guess it used to be used as a home pest control. And so they used to use it for, I guess, urban pest management. So you think about cockroaches and termites and ants. It's starting to be used more in some, pastures and orchards. So sometimes this can be used in, pecan groves and some of these type of large orchards. But, I guess I do see a little bit more in pest management, but it's very, very rare. And this is another one that's starting to be phased out, which is really fortunate. I guess I would say that all these organophosphates are starting to be phased out because we're starting to learn more that they're extremely toxic, and there's other options that are less toxic to bees. Acephate is another one that's commonly used in cotton, peanuts, and turfgrass. Um, Dimethoate is one that's commonly used in alfalfa and wheat. And so dimethoate is another one that's usually used in these rural areas, especially in West Texas where they're growing alfalfa. But I do see a lot of this in East Texas, and the eastern corner of Texas. And so you might see this a bit more across the state. But like I mentioned, I'm glad that some of these are starting to be phased out. Carbamates and organic phosphates are very similar in that they both target that enzyme. And this is another one that's also toxic, like organophosphates. So, when we think about toxic ones, nicotinoids and pyrethroids, but carbamate can be one that's extremely toxic to bees. But it really depends on the type that's being used. And so some are really toxic, some aren't, but we're still learning more about the sublethal effects. And so this carbamate can be, stored in the comb and cause some of these long-term effects on learning, memory, and foraging for the bees. I think I have a picture, yeah. And so like I mentioned, it attacks this esterase. So if I go back to this graphic, basically organophosphates and carbamates are attacking this enzyme, so it's unable to break down this acetylcholine that causes that channel to remain open and causes overstimulation and nerve issues with the bees. But this is all to say, before I get into the muscle section, nicotinoids, pyrethroids, organophosphates, and carbamates, all those classes of insecticides are all attacking the similar system and having the same effect on the nerve system. And so if you see, I guess, massive die-offs and you see bees that are shaking and appear paralyzed, it could be due to a lot of different things. And so you can't just blame on nicotinoids. It could be a pyrethroid, it could be organic phosphate, it could be a carbamate. So we really don't know unless we actually test for it. Because really the effects are very similar across them all, and the symptoms are very similar. So the first part was kind of focusing on the insecticides that target the nervous system. And so next, some of these target the muscle system. So, honeybees have a wide range of muscles throughout their bodies that allow them to, one, fly, forage, and move. Some are involved with their reproduction, some are involved with their stinging, some are involved with their digestion. So muscles are throughout the entire honeybee body and are involved with anything. I mean, if you look at us, right, we have muscles throughout our body that are involved with everything involved with eating, walking, um, our heart system, things like that. So it's involved with a lot of different things. And so these muscle type things can affect everything related to bees. So the only one that attacks muscles that are very common are these diamides. So diamides, what they do is they target the muscle. So they go into the muscle tissues and they basically open or shut this muscle system. So either that one causes overstimulation, so those muscles are moving rapidly, or two, it closes that off so that bees are unable to move. But typically, what they do is they target the muscles, they open up this channel, and that allows this calcium ions to flow through the system and cause an overstimulation. And so, really, the only diamide that's commonly used in Texas is ryanodine. And so, this is probably the most common. But like I said, it disrupts this calcium flow and causes paralysis because it's impacting directly onto the muscles. Now, versus some of the nervous system ones, these are generally less toxic to honeybees, but they can have a sublethal effects on bees because if it's impacting their muscles, that can impact their ability to nurse, impact their ability to forage, impact their ability to guard the colony, impact their ability to do everything. It can also impact queen fertility and queen longevity. And then the final one are insect growth regulators. So Like I mentioned last week, honeybees go through these different molts and different stages of development. So they're going from, young larva into late stage larva. And as they go from one age to the next, they're basically molting and getting bigger. Well, what these insect growth regulators do is they target these larvae, so they're basically stuck at this stage. It's kind of like a time machine, or not time machine, but they're kind of frozen in time where they're stuck at this larval stage and unable to pupate and get to the next stage. And eventually they really die and they're unable to develop. And so what happens is because these are unable to develop, that can cause your colony to rapidly decline. That can cause issues with your colony to grow. But one thing that insect regulators, growth regulators really impact is the queen. So they're not only targeting metamorphosis and molting for the larva, they actually can get into the queen and really impact your ovaries and impact your egg laying capacity. And so a lot of times, the biggest effect for growth regulators are actually on the queen. Because they're kind of generally safe for adult bees, but they typically impact the larva stages and adult queens. But one thing with these is they can really build up in the wax and the pollen, and so they can sit in the wax for a long period of time, and really all these insecticides can, but this is one that can remain in the wax for a long period of time and remain toxic in the wax for a long period of time. And that's one reason that it could have long-lasting effects on development, because if that's in the wax and there's brood, living in that wax, then these larvae may be unable to grow and reproduce and get to the next stage. And actually, well, I'll get to the next one, but yeah, I'll talk about best practices and think about what you should do while you comb if you think you have a pesticide related kill. So, best practice for beekeepers, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where you never know where the spray is coming from. And I think the biggest issue comes in these urban environments because you have a lot of these small lots and individual people spraying, and so you have no idea what's being sprayed when and where. And a lot of times your bees may be hidden, so your neighbors might not be able to alert you of your colonies. But even if your bees aren't hidden, your bees can fly somewhere between a mile to 3 to 5 miles away. And so especially in urban environments where bees may have to fly a farther distance away, they risk more exposure in an urban environment. And so some of these practices, it's kind of tough, and it really depends on communication with the applicators. And a lot of times beekeepers don't have constant communication or direct access to their neighbors or applicators. But if an applicator does contact you, or you know that there's a spray occurring, and so a lot of times with cities and counties, they alert the general public about mosquito abatement and other sprays. And so if you know that there's a spray occurring, it's going to be occurring, near your apiaries. One thing you can do is cover your colonies. And so you can cover your colonies or cover with a kind of a wet sheet, for 12 to 24 hours, just so your bees are unable to forage and leave the colony. And that doesn't risk them to have exposure to some of these insecticides. But like I said, it really depends. I mean, you can't keep your colony covered year round. So it kind of depends on having the applicators contact you or neighbors contact you when they're actually spraying. If you are contacted, one thing you can do is move your colonies. And so, one thing that's nice about bees is they can be easily moved. And so if you have a lot of colonies, you use a tractor or a forklift. We have one or two colonies, you can move them out of the area. But a lot of time, the easiest thing to do is probably cover your colonies and make sure the foragers aren't exposed to that toxic insecticide. If you start seeing some symptoms, one thing you can do is feed your colonies with protein. It's not the fix all, but it can help. I've seen some studies that show that if you feed protein patties when your bees are starting to dwindle or exposed to some kind of toxic chemical, that can definitely help with some of the damage. You will see some, pesticide-related losses, but it might be able to mitigate the effects. One thing I didn't have on here was comb removal. So for me, I think a general practice is try to replace your comb every 5 years, because this comb can accumulate a lot of wax and residues from multiple years. And it can stick in that wax for long periods of time and cause some of these sublethal effects. And so what I try to do is try to replace my comb every 5 years. And so taking a few combs out and put a new foundation each year is one way to mitigate it. If you do have a lot of comb within your colony that you think's been exposed to pesticides, you could replace all that, but it is tough to start everything from a foundation again. I think James had a question.
Yeah, and speaking to that, if when I harvest my comb every 4 to 5 years, I pull all the dark comb out and I harvest the wax and I reuse that wax to wax my new frames. Does that pesticide transmit to over to the new frames, or should I just get rid of that comb completely? That wax
That's
comb.
that's a good question because it's tough to know if you have wax or pesticide residue in your wax. But we do know if you heat up to a certain temperature, it can degrade some of the pesticides, but I'm not sure about all of them. So let me look that up because I think there's probably some studies that have shown that like how to render wax to remove all that into the wax. And so I'm not quite sure about all of them. I would say that if you're heating up to a certain temperature, it's going to degrade most of that wax, but I really can't say for sure. I mean, it could be getting into some of the rendering that you're making.
Okay, thank you.
So one thing I tell a lot of applicators is to just simply read the label. I think they all kind of roll my eyes when I tell them this, but all the information about whether it's toxic and how toxic to bees is always on the label. And so when you think about the label, there's really four major sections and that relate to bees and pollinators. So the first part is this environmental hazard section. And so what it'll say is something along the lines as toxic or highly toxic to bees. And so if you see it's saying highly toxic, that means it's extremely toxic and extremely deadly for bees and pollinators. Probably the most important part is this number two is this residual toxicity. And so what we'll say is foraging or visiting means pesticide is toxic for more than 8 hours. And so one thing I don't like about this is it's not very clear to applicators. Because foraging and visiting, I mean, it'd be nice to have an hour next to that. Because if it's toxic for more than 8 hours, then what that means is once your bees start, even if it's applied at night or at dawn, then once your bees start flying out, it's still gonna be toxic when the bees are going out to the flower sources and collecting. And so I wish they had like hours next to this because something can be really toxic, but if it's only toxic for 4 hours and applied when the bees aren't flying, then by the time the bees are flying the next day, it's not gonna be toxic anymore. So, but yeah, a lot of times they'll say do not apply to flowering plants, and so I mean, I really hope that I mean they're I guess it is a law for them to apply it and apply it according to label. So I do think that they do apply according to label and do follow the laws and regulations. So, if it does say foraging or visiting, just and it says do not apply to flowering plants, I don't think they'll be applying it. But there could be some nefarious things too. Sometimes it may say actively foraging or actively visiting. And so what this means is it's toxic for less than 8 hours. And so these are the ones that you want to look for because if you're applying this at night and it's less toxic than 8 hours, that means you can apply it at night, and by the time the bees are foraging again, it's not toxic anymore. So I don't think this label is very clear to applicators. I'd rather they put just like only apply at night or only apply to flowering plants, but it kind of depends on the type of pesticide, the type of label. It also has another section about precautions. So some labels have a bee advisory section, some don't. Typically, their labels looks just like this with a small bee on it. And then they have directions about how to use around pests to also benefit pollinators. But when you're looking at the label, the most important part is this residual toxicity, and I'll talk about this a little bit more because you want to avoid this one. You want to avoid the ones where it says foraging and visiting because those are toxic for more than 8 hours, and those are the most toxic to honeybees. And if you have to, if applicators have to, you want to use this one where it's toxic for less than 4 hours and apply it at night. So one thing with applicators and also beekeepers is to communicate with the Texas Apiary Inspection Service. I think Hannah was on the call, and so she can provide a bit more information. I'm not sure if she wants to jump on and talk about what the TIS service does, but there's sort of a communication pipeline, and there's something that you can report some bee kills to or communicate any related losses to.
Hear me?
And so, oh yeah, Hannah, are you here?
Sorry. I'm here.
Yeah. Do you want to talk
Um,
about your guys' role in pesticides, whether that's a beekeeper or an applicator?
um, as far as pesticides go, with the Apiary Inspection Service, we do occasionally get notifications of bee sprays that are going to happen. There's boll weevil sprays and things like that. We are not notified by every single county that do like mosquito spray and stuff. But if we are notified, we do reach out to the beekeepers that have bees in those counties that we're aware of. So that is one benefit of being registered with our office. So the Apiary Inspection Service is the state regulatory agency for beekeeping. We do a lot of inspections, be it requested inspections, migratory inspections, queen breeder inspections, things like that. But we do occasionally get notifications from different pesticide applicators saying, hey, we're going to be spraying in this area. And if we receive those notifications, we happily send those out to the beekeepers. And in order to get on that list, you need to be registered with our office. Beekeeper registration is annual. It's valid from September 1st through August 31st of each year. And that registration has a $35 annual fee. And I think that's the really short overview because I know that this is not about me.
No, and you want to talk, so let's say a beekeeper thinks they had a pesticide related kill, like do they contact you or they contact TDA? I think they contact TAAS, but you want to talk more about if they think they had a pesticide related kill and like steps forward with that?
Currently in the state of Texas, if you have a pesticide kill, there are places to report that. You can find that on our office webpage under the For Beekeepers section in the testing resources area. And so basically, in the state of Texas, there aren't a lot of procedures and things to help beekeepers in those instances, but you can absolutely report that to a few people, and they may send someone out. I have been informed a few times where people who have had pesticide sprays were not satisfied with the response they received, but that is, it's not in our office. But we do have those links on our webpage. So if you suspect a pesticide kill, absolutely report it. But they may not send somebody out to take pictures and go through hives because the people who do that testing in Texas are not bee knowledgeable, unfortunately.
Okay, perfect. Well, I really appreciate you jumping on here quick. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but you know more about your service
No
than I
worries.
do, so I really appreciate it. One
Yeah,
thing,
no
yeah,
worries.
one thing Hannah did mention is registering your colonies. So like she mentioned, it is optional, but if your colonies are registered, and she can talk more about being totally anonymous. Your information is anonymous, and if you register your location is totally anonymous. Like nobody can see that information, so you can worry about that getting
Yeah, we
leaked.
don't
But
share
if
that.
sorry,
We don't share that information. That
yep,
is
exactly.
private
So
information.
it's private information. Yep, exactly. And I'm sure you go through a lot of training to make sure you learn how to keep things private. I can imagine.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but yeah. We have one thing too is we're developing a portal for applicators. So if they are spraying in your area, they can alert all the beekeepers in a certain regions. We are working on that. So the applicators won't have access to any of your information. So I want to be clear that that's entirely anonymous and something that's not shared to anybody. But if the applicator is spraying in like one GPS location, we can alert all the beekeepers in surrounding areas to tell you that they're spraying, tell you what they're spraying, and what practices you need to do. And so that's one reason I do require registering your colonies as part of this program because the Texas Apiary Inspection Service is a really good system, and I think it's be really beneficial to beekeepers, especially to pesticide related damage or kills or preventing them, I guess. Okay, so practice for applicators, and one thing I always talk about is residual toxicity. And so I don't know, like I talk about the label a little bit more, but I like to go into more depth about what residual toxicity means because it can say foraging or visiting or actively foraging and actively visiting. And to me, that's not clear at all. Um, I mean, what's the difference between foraging and actively foraging if you don't know what that means? To me, that's extremely confusing and extremely confusing for an applicator. So I like to walk them through about what residual toxicity means and what ones they should be looking for. So when you think about residual toxicity, there's really three major categories for honeybees. And residual toxicity depends on how long is that chemical toxic to honeybees. The most toxic chemicals are the ones that are toxic for over 8 hours. And so some of these can be toxic for 8 hours to even multiple weeks. So that means that even if you apply it at night when the bees are all in their colony, the next day when they're actively foraging, they can be exposed to those pesticides for, maybe a couple hours, but even for multiple weeks. And so these ones are the most toxic and the ones you should remove. And if you look at the applicator, Those are the ones that where it says actively foraging or actively visiting. But some pesticides can be only toxic for 8 hours, and some could be toxic for 2 weeks. And so I think they need to put clearly how long is it toxic to bees, because one that's 8 hours is totally different than one that's toxic for multiple weeks. So it's really important to know how long it's toxic for so beekeepers can make some kind of management to prevent any losses. Now, the ones that are kind of moderately toxic are the ones that have residual toxicity of 4 to 8 hours, or the ones that are toxic for less than 4 hours. So that means is, applicators can still apply that at night, and then by the time the bees are actively foraging again the next day, then those are no longer toxic or not as toxic to honeybees. And so one thing I generally recommend to applicators is, I mean, first, choose the ones with no toxicity. I mean, if possible, choose the bee safe and pollinator safe options. But if you have to, and I really can't control what they're applying, I can give them information, but I can control what they're using. But I try to push from ones that are in this orange and not this red. And so one thing I do tell them is choose the ones that say foraging or visiting, because these are the ones that you do not apply to flowering plants and you only apply, or no, actively foraging, sorry. The ones that are toxic for less than 8 hours and can only be applied at night. And so I actually have a long list of this, and I will send you the list. So I have a list of maybe 100 pesticides used across the state of Texas. Maybe not that many, but I have quite a few. And I have the residual toxicity next to each of them. And so if you're curious about a pesticide and how long its residual toxicity is, then that should have all the information. Because when you're looking at a pesticide, they can be toxic, but what it really depends is the residual toxicity. But toxicity, so I mean, all these can be really toxic. Chlorpyrifos, malathion, which are pyrethroids, and so on. And so some are really toxic, but the residual toxicity can be less. And so chlorpyrifos, which is an OP organophosphate, I believe, is toxic for 4 to 6 days. So if that's applied, bees can be exposed to that for nearly a week, and that can be extremely toxic to bees for almost a week. Whereas malathion, which is commonly used for mosquito abatement, is only toxic for 3 hours. So that means if a city or a county is using a mosquito abatement and they're applying this at night, by the time the bees are actively foraging, this is no longer going to be as toxic to honeybees. But then permethrin is another pyrethroid, and this is toxic for nearly 5 days. So if it's applied at night, it can be toxic for multiple days. So it doesn't matter if you apply it at night, the bees are still be exposed to it for nearly a week. Bifenthrin is one that's commonly used and it's toxic for 4 to 6 hours, and so on. And so what I tell a lot of them is like all these can be toxic in their own way, but what depends is how long they're toxic for, because if they're toxic for longer periods of time, that's going to impact honeybees. But one thing I will mention is the thing that I guess the bees that have the biggest impact from pesticides are the native pollinators. These are ones that are unmanaged. These are ones that are, typically live in the soil or brushes or trees. And so these pesticides are probably having the biggest effect on these native pollinators versus honeybees. But that's not to say they don't affect honeybees, but when you think about this, we should be more concerned about some of the pollinators. Practice for applicators is wind conditions. So I talked a lot about drift, and whether you're doing an aerial application or you're doing a field spray, if it's really windy or the environment isn't optimal, then these can drift directly onto your colony or have indirect effects on bees. And so typically less drift occurs with ground application like this versus like an aerial application where a plane's flying over. But that's not to say that drift doesn't occur with this. Drift can also occur with seed planting. So if those seeds are treated with neonicotinoids and they're planted and it's really windy, those nicotinoids can get into the dust. That dust can fly around and either get onto a plant that the bees are foraging on or directly onto a colony. Now, for applicators, there's different technologies they can use to spray to reduce drift, and it really depends on the wind conditions. It really depends on what they're applying, but they can choose a very specific sprayer and nozzle to reduce drift. And so typically, I guess when I talk to applicators, I talk about different nozzle technologies that they can use. I'm not gonna bore you with that information unless you're really interested and want to learn more. But there's different technologies that they can use to reduce some of this drift. Um, and one thing that they should do is minimize droplets less than 150 microns, because they drift farther. So the bigger ones don't drift as much, and so on. Weather conditions play a really big role. So I talked about, residual toxicity, and I guess for me, it's really hard to put a set number on some of these pesticides and how long they're toxic for, because there's so many variables that go into whether something's toxic and how long they're toxic for. But we know that if, temperatures are really low and the dew is in the forecast, that makes these pesticides toxic for a longer period of time. So even though on the label it may say it's only toxic for 4 hours, if the weather conditions aren't right, that can make them toxic for 8 hours to 10 hours. So it really depends on a lot of these weather conditions because that can make them even more toxic and even twice as toxic as during the best weather conditions. Formulations also make a really big difference. So some formulations are more toxic to honeybees versus other ones. And so one thing I talk to applicators is when they're making their formulation and mixing their pesticide to try to use less toxic formulations. And so here's kind of a chart. This is what I got from Washington State. I'm kind of curious why they have systemic and seed coatings in the yellow, and so I'm gonna look more into that because I guess maybe they're thinking that it's not directly toxic to bees, but it's more long-term toxicity. I'm not quite sure, but we do know the formulations that are most toxic to bees are these micro encapsulated formulations, the dusting formulations, the wettable powder formulations, so on. And the ones that have intermediate toxicity are the emulsifiable concentrate. So I try to kind of push applicators to some of these less toxic formulations. And then one thing a lot of farmers can do is, I guess, non-chemical pest control. So I think just in general as a society and as an industry is kind of pushing for, non-chemical options. So, crop rotation. So one issue with some of these pests is if you're growing, one crop for fields and fields and fields, these pests can persist and cause bigger issues. But if you do a sort of a crop rotation, it's a really important way to disrupt the pest population, and reduce that pest overall. So it's kind of when we think about beekeeping, we think about brood breaks, which I'll talk about in the next session. If we're integrating brood breaks, that's a really important non-chemical control of the varroa mite. Farmers can do the exact same thing if they're practicing crop rotation. Interplanting is one thing where they plant, pest repellent plants between some of their crops. And so some of the most common ones are marigolds, garlic, and basil, and they have certain substances that can deter some of these pests naturally. But sometimes they can also introduce some of these, wasp species that target some of the pests. And so it can be a really important way to get some of these, vespids and wasps to kill off some of the pests within their yard. And then diversification is really important. So cover crops, wildflower strips, and so on. So let's say you planted corn year in, year out. As you plant that corn year in, year out, that pest is going to get worse, worse, and worse. But if you're rotating between clover and corn and soybeans, then you'll be applying less treatment later on. So to me, diversification and cover cropping is a really important way to control some of this stuff. And so a lot of this comes with like teaching and educating farmers and applicators about some of these issues and making them more aware about some of the problems and things that they can do that doesn't involve chemicals. So best practices for applicators, there's really 5 major practices. So number one is communication. So we are developing a communication pipeline with the apiary inspection service so we can communicate information about a spray to beekeepers that have their locations registered. I talked about, formulation. So try to use less toxic formulations if possible. But more importantly, and this is more importantly, is try to use ones that have a lower residual toxicity. So choose the ones that have either a no toxicity or ones that are toxic for less than 4 hours. And then choose an optimal weather conditions. So ones that are windy and the weather conditions are optimal. Okay, perfect. Well, that's the end of this first session. So I think we'll take 10 minutes. And so I think we'll come back at 10:50. And if you have any questions, just leave in the chat and we can put in the Q&A session. So I'm gonna stop the recording here quick and we'll start it up at 10:50.